Chapter 1: The Iron Scent of Solitude. The mountain air tasted like frozen needles and pine resin, a sharp, punishing cold that Kaia Vale welcomed because it meant no one else was brave enough to breathe it. She dragged a heavy crate of firewood across the porch of her cabin, the wood groaning against the floorboards like a tired animal. This remote sanctuary sat on the jagged edge of rival packlands, a place where the wind howled through skeletal branches and the trees grew thick enough to swallow secrets whole. She preferred this isolation. It didn't ask about her father's disgrace or stare at the invisible brand of contamination she carried. 7 years had passed since she was the beta's daughter, admired, scrutinized, and eventually discarded like a diseased limb. A sudden, jarring shift in the breeze caused her to freeze, her nostrils flaring as she caught in scent that shouldn't exist here. It wasn't the earthy musk of the forest or the damp rot of the nearby creek. It was metallic, sharp, copper-heavy, and undeniably royal. Alpha blood. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of old fears rising from the grave. Why was the essence of leadership drifting through these forbidden woods? She scanned the tree line, where the shadows stretched like long skeletal fingers reaching for her throat. The silence here was usually a comfort, but now it felt heavy and pregnant with a threat she couldn't yet see. Because she had built this life on the ashes of her dignity, Kaia refused to let a stray smell drive her into a panic. She forced her breathing to level out, drawing the frigid air deep into her lungs until it bit. Her father had once told her that a wolf who loses her cool loses her life. And even if he was a disgraced man, his lessons remained her only inheritance. She reached for the silver-handled knife tucked into her belt, the cool metal grounding her. A low, rhythmic thud echoed from the forest. Heavy footsteps, or perhaps the staggering gait of something dying. She retreated into the cabin, pulling the heavy oak door shut and sliding the iron bolt home with a final, echoing clack. Inside, the shadows danced as she lit a single tallow candle, its flickering amber flame casting long, distorted shapes across the walls. The cabin was a fortress of her own making, filled with dried herbs and the scent of cedar, far removed from the gold-trimmed halls of her youth. Yet, as she stood in the center of the room, she felt an odd vibration beneath her feet. It wasn't the settling of the foundation or the wind rattling the floorboards. It was a soft, wet sound. The sound of labored breathing coming from directly beneath her bed frame. Her wolf, dormant and sluggish since the day of her public shaming, suddenly paced behind her ribs, its fur bristling in an instinctive, protective snarl. Transitioning from caution to a cold, focused intensity, Kaia dropped to her knees. She gripped the edge of the moth-eaten rug and pulled it back, exposing the dark space under the heavy pine slats. 2 glowing amber eyes stared back at her, wide with a terror so profound it made her own breath hitch. It wasn't a monster or an assassin. Huddled in the dust was a small, trembling boy, no older than 5, his expensive silk shirt shredded and soaked in a dark, terrifying crimson. He looked like a fallen star dragged through the mud, and as he let out a tiny, broken whimper, Kaia realized her isolation had just been shattered by the one thing she promised never to touch again, the fate of an alpha heir. The woods outside let out a low, mourning groan, as if the trees themselves knew that blood was about to be spilled on their roots. Chapter 2: The Ghost in the Snow. The sight of the bleeding child triggered a jagged memory, a mental fracture that sent Kaia spiraling back to her 18th winter. She could almost feel the biting wind of the great circle and see the judgmental eyes of 500 wolves boring into her. She remembered the way the snow felt like shards of glass against her bare knees, as she was forced to kneel before the pack. Her fated mate, a man she had adored since childhood, stood above her with a face carved from granite. "I, Julian of the Blackwood, reject you, Kaia Vale," he had declared, his voice booming like a funeral bell. "I will not tether my legacy to the daughter of a traitor." Because that humiliation had rewired her brain, she viewed every connection as a potential trap. She saw the sneers of the pack members, heard the whispers of contamination, and felt the crushing weight of being publicly discarded. She had been the beta's golden girl, and in one afternoon she became a pariah. The rejection had been a slow-acting poison, convincing her that love was merely a precursor to public humiliation. Now, staring at this wounded heir, she saw the same look of abandonment she had once worn, a child caught in the gears of a power struggle he couldn't possibly understand. Moving with careful, non-threatening motions, she fetched a bowl of warm water and clean linens from her washstand. Every second she spent tending to him was a second she spent inviting the pack's chaos back into her life. She knew that where there was a wounded royal, there were hunters with sharpened blades and cold hearts. The boy finally allowed her to pull him from the shadows, his head lolling against her shoulder as she lifted him onto the bed. His skin was burning with a fever that suggested more than just physical injury. There was a darkness in his veins, a shimmering purple hue that spoke of wolfsbane. Following the initial shock, a protective fire began to simmer in her chest, pushing back the cold walls of her detachment. She cleaned the gash on the boy's shoulder, her fingers steady despite the chaos screaming in her mind. He was an alpha, the very symbol of the world that had spat her out, yet his tiny hand gripped her thumb with a strength born of pure desperation. She realized then that fate was a cruel jester, bringing her the one thing she could never ignore, an innocent life caught in a storm of pack politics. She would protect him, not because he was an heir, but because she knew what it felt like to be hunted by your own kind. A sharp, violent scratching suddenly erupted from directly beneath the floorboards, right where the boy had been hiding moments before. Kaia froze, her heart leaping into her throat as the sound intensified, claws tearing at the wood with a frantic, desperate energy. This wasn't the boy's doing. Something else was trying to get in, or perhaps something had been lurking there even before the child arrived. She stood up, her hand flying to the hilt of her knife, her eyes fixed on the vibrating planks. Before she could process the threat, the front door of the cabin didn't just open. It disintegrated under a force so immense the hinges screamed in agony. The candle snuffed out as the mountain storm burst into her home, bringing with it the scent of death and old, unhealed wounds. Chapter 3. The King of Ruin. Dust and splinters filled the air, swirling in the moonlight as a massive silhouette filled the ruined doorway. The man who stood there was a living mountain of muscle and suppressed rage, his presence so commanding it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He was drenched in the rain of a sudden mountain storm, his dark hair plastered to a forehead marked by a jagged, fresh scar. Kaia didn't need to see his crest to know who he was. The air around him hummed with the undeniable, suffocating pressure of a high alpha. This was Ronan, the man whose name was whispered in hushed, terrified tones. The alpha of alphas. The mate bond hit her with the force of a physical blow, a shimmering tether of golden light that snapped into place between their souls. It was an agonizing irony that made her knees buckle. After years of hiding, fate had tracked her down and paired her with the most dangerous wolf in existence. Ronan's eyes, a swirling storm of gray and silver, locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat, the rage in his expression faltered into pure shock. He didn't move. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his scent of rain and sandalwood crashing over her like a tidal wave. Because he was a man accustomed to absolute dominance, Ronan recovered instantly, his gaze shifting to the bed where the heir lay. He moved with a speed that defied his size, but Kaia was faster, her silver knife flashing in the moonlight as she stepped into his path. "Don't touch him," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a courage she didn't know she still possessed. Ronan stopped, his lip curling into a snarl that revealed bone-white fangs. "Step aside, little wolf," he growled, his voice vibrating deep in his barrel chest. "You have no idea what you are interfering with." Drawing upon her defensive pride, she refused to flinch, even as the alpha's aura threatened to crush her spirit. "He's terrified. He's poisoned, and I won't let you or anyone else hurt him further," she retorted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a wire pulled so taut it was seconds away from snapping. Ronan's eyes narrowed, his gaze traveling over her face as if searching for a familiar ghost. He recognized her, not just as his mate, but as the girl whose humiliation he had watched from the shadows years ago. Building on this sudden recognition, Ronan's aggression vanished, replaced by a desperate, raw vulnerability that shattered her perception of him. He dropped his head, a flash of genuine agony crossing his features before he looked back at Kaia. "I am not his enemy," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I am his father, and they are coming to kill us both." As if on cue, a low, melodic whistle echoed from the woods outside, the signal of a professional hunting party. The realization settled in Kaia's gut like lead. Her quiet life was over, and the man she had sworn to hate was the only thing standing between her and a pack of assassins. The boy on the bed let out a soft cry, and in that moment, the cabin became a fortress under siege, binding 3 broken souls together in a pact of blood and survival. Chapter 4: The Predator's Sanctuary. The cabin walls seemed to shrink as the presence of a high alpha filled every corner, his scent of ozone and crushed pine needles drowning out the familiar smell of her dried lavender. Ronan moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his eyes never leaving the doorway he had just shattered. He didn't ask for permission to stay because he was a man who took what he needed, yet there was a tremor in his massive hands as he reached toward his son. Kaia watched him with a mixture of burning resentment and a physical pull so strong it felt like a hook lodged in her sternum. The mate bond was a living thing between them, pulsing with an unwanted rhythm that mocked her 7 years of carefully constructed solitude. Because the mountain storm was now screaming against the roof, the world outside felt like a chaotic abyss, leaving this small room as the only island of safety. Kaia moved to the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she peered into the dark. She could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of torchlight through the dense tree line, moving like the eyes of a hungry beast. The assassins weren't just following a scent, they were hunting a legacy. She turned back to Ronan, who was now kneeling by the bed, his forehead pressed against the child's small, feverish hand. It was a sight that didn't fit the legends of the Butcher Alpha, a man who had supposedly paved his way to the throne with the bones of his enemies. The arrows were dipped in concentrated nightshade and silver, Kaia stated, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. Ronan looked up, his silver eyes flashing with a predatory sharpness that made her breath hitch. He didn't look like a king in that moment. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the cage was shrinking. "If we don't flush the toxins within the hour, his heart will stop," she continued, her words driving a fresh spike of agony through the alpha's composed mask. She moved toward her apothecary shelf, her hands shaking as she reached for the vials of wolfsbane extract, the only thing that could counter the poison by triggering a violent purging shift. Transitioning from a silent observer to an active participant in this nightmare, Kaia began grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone was the only sound in the room, a countdown to a choice she wasn't ready to make. She could feel Ronan watching her, his gaze heavy with 1,000 questions he didn't have the right to ask. He recognized the way she moved, the defensive tilt of her shoulders, and the way she refused to meet his eyes. He knew exactly who she was, the girl he had watched the Blackwood pack break in the name of stability. "Why are you helping him?" Ronan asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very floorboards beneath her feet. Kaia stopped grinding, her grip on the pestle tightening until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on the green paste she was creating. "Because he is a child who hasn't learned how to be a monster yet," she replied, her voice cold and hollow. "And because, unlike you, I know what it feels like to be left for dead by the people who were supposed to protect me." The child let out a sharp, guttural cry as the first wave of the purging shift hit his tiny frame, his bones beginning to click and reform with a sickening wet sound. Chapter 5: The Weight of the Crown. Ronan recoiled as if he had been struck, the truth in Kaia's words carving a deeper wound than any assassin's blade ever could. He watched his son thrash on the bed, the boy's skin shimmering as his wolf struggled to break through the poison-induced paralysis. The alpha reached out, his fingers hovering over the boy's brow, but he hesitated, fearing his own frantic energy would only worsen the child's pain. He was a master of war and a dealer of death, yet here, in a small cabin belonging to a woman he had once failed, he was utterly powerless. The arrogance that usually defined his posture was gone, replaced by a crushing weight that seemed to bow his broad shoulders. Building on the shared tension of the child's suffering, the mate bond flared, sending a wave of Ronan's raw grief crashing into Kaia's mind. She gasped, dropping the mortar as the foreign emotion flooded her senses. Images of a burning nursery, the scent of a dying mate, and the crushing loneliness of a throne built on secrets. She saw a flash of the council's faces, cold and calculating, as they whispered about the necessity of removing the weak link. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a coup. Ronan wasn't just running from assassins, he was running from the very system he had spent his life upholding. "I didn't want it to happen," Ronan whispered, his voice so broken it was barely recognizable. He wasn't talking about the child. He was looking at Kaia, his eyes searching hers for a forgiveness she didn't have the capacity to give. "The day they rejected you, I was there to stop a civil war, not to watch a girl be destroyed." Kaia let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You chose the pack over a person, Ronan?" she snapped, her eyes blazing with 7 years of accumulated fury. "You chose power over justice, and now that same power is coming to take the only thing you have left." Because the truth was a bitter pill, Ronan didn't argue. He simply stood up and walked toward her, his proximity creating a heat that made her skin tingle and her wolf howl in protest. He stopped just inches away, the scent of him, smoke, leather, and ancient forest, filling her lungs until she felt lightheaded. He was so close she could see the silver flecks in his iris and the pulse leaping in his thick neck. "Help me save him, Kaia," he pleaded, his hand coming up to hover near her cheek, but never quite touching. "Help me save Leo, and I will give you anything. My throne, my life, my head on a silver platter." The window shattered as a black-feathered arrow hissed through the air, thudding into the wooden headboard just inches above the boy's head. Kaia dived for the child, her body acting as a shield before her mind could even process the danger. Ronan was already moving, his transition into his wolf form a violent, bone-snapping explosion of fur and muscle that happened in the blink of an eye. A massive, midnight black wolf now stood where the man had been, his eyes glowing like twin embers in the dark. He let out a roar that shook the mountain, a sound of pure, unadulterated carnage that announced to the hunters that the king was no longer running. The shadows outside the cabin detached themselves from the trees, revealing the silver-masked faces of the council's elite guard as they closed in for the kill. Chapter 6. The Covenant of Blood. The first assassin burst through the ruined door, a silver blade gleaming in the moonlight, but he never made it 3 steps across the floor. Ronan's black wolf was a blur of shadow and teeth, intercepting the hunter mid-air with a sickening crunch of breaking ribs. The cabin, once her place of peace, was instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse. Blood sprayed across the cedar-planked walls, the copper scent mixing with the acrid smell of burnt wolfsbane. Kaia huddled over the boy, her arms wrapped around his shaking frame, her eyes wide as she watched the man who was her mate become a whirlwind of divine violence. Following the initial surge of the attack, 3 more hunters vaulted through the windows, their movements synchronized and lethal. They weren't common pack members. They were the High Council's executioners, trained specifically to take down alphas. They moved in a triangle formation, using long, silver-tipped spears to keep Ronan's massive wolf at a distance. Kaia saw the trap before Ronan did. The 4th hunter was crouching on the roof, preparing to drop through the rafters with a glass vial of liquid silver. "Ronan, above you!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the growls and the clashing of metal. Because she had warned him, the black wolf lunged to the side just as the roof gave way. The vial shattered on the floor where he had stood a second before, the liquid silver hissing and eating through the wood like acid. Kaia didn't stay idle. She reached into the hidden pocket of her skirt and pulled out a handful of dried nightshade berries, throwing them into the fireplace. A thick purple smoke billowed out, filling the room with a hallucinogenic cloud that only affected those with active wolf genes. The hunters stumbled, their coordination breaking as the toxins hit their heightened senses, giving Ronan the opening he needed to tear through their throats. Transitioning from a witness to a warrior, Kaia grabbed her silver knife and drove it into the thigh of a hunter who had crawled too close to the bed. The man shrieked, his human mask slipping as he shifted partially into a grotesque, half-formed beast. She didn't hesitate. She twisted the blade, her face set in a mask of cold, vengeful determination. This was for her father. This was for the girl in the snow. This was for the life they had stolen from her. Beside her, the black wolf paused, his blood-soaked muzzle turning toward her with a look of profound, startled respect. They were fighting together, a traitor's daughter and a butcher king, defending a future they both feared. The last of the assassins fell, his life pooling on the floorboards, leaving the cabin in a ringing, terrifying silence. Ronan shifted back into his human form, his skin glistening with sweat and the blood of his enemies, his chest heaving as he stared at the carnage. He looked at Kaia, then at his son, who was finally breathing steadily as the shift completed. The boy's skin was clear, the purple veins gone, replaced by a healthy, golden glow. They had won the night, but as the distant sound of a war horn echoed from the valley below, they both knew the hunt had only just begun. Ronan reached out, his bloody hand finally settling on Kaia's shoulder, and this time, she didn't pull away from the heat of his touch. Chapter 7. The Fragile Fortress. The aftermath of the slaughter left the cabin smelling of copper and wet fur, a heavy, suffocating scent that clung to the back of Kaia's throat. She stood in the center of the wreckage, her hands trembling as she wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. Ronan remained standing by the shattered doorway, his naked torso a roadmap of fresh gouges and old silver-white scars that told stories of 100 forgotten battles. The moonlight played over the ridges of his muscles, casting him as a god of ruin in the middle of her humble sanctuary. The mate bond, now fully awakened by the shared adrenaline of combat, hummed between them like a live wire, vibrating with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight for her body. Because the silence was more unnerving than the violence had been, Kaia began to move, her boots splashing through a puddle of dark fluid as she gathered fresh water. She didn't look at Ronan, focusing instead on the rhythmic task of cleaning her knife, but she could feel his silver gaze tracking every shift of her weight. He was an alpha without a pack, a king without a throne, yet he still commanded the very air she breathed. The proximity was a physical pressure, a heat that radiated from him and settled in the pit of her stomach, stirring desires she had spent 7 years burying under layers of ice and resentment. "You fight like someone who has spent every day of the last 7 years preparing for a war," Ronan observed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He stepped closer, the scent of him, primal, masculine, and dangerous, overwhelming the metallic tang of the room. Kaia finally looked up, her eyes hard as flint. "I didn't prepare for a war, Ronan. I prepared for the day the world realized I was still alive and came to finish the job," she replied, her words cutting through the air like a lash. She reached out to take a clean cloth, but her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt of pure electric heat shot up her arm, making her gasp. Transitioning from a distance to a dangerous intimacy, Ronan didn't pull away. Instead, he closed the gap, trapping her between his massive frame and the heavy oak table. He was so close she could see the frantic pulse in his throat and the way his pupils blown wide, swallowing the silver of his irises. "I thought you were dead," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "After the rejection, you vanished. I sent scouts. I searched the borders, but you were a ghost." Kaia's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. "You searched for a ghost to ease your guilt, not to save a woman," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Following the pull of the bond, her body betrayed her, leaning into his heat even as her mind screamed for retreat. Ronan's hand rose, his thick fingers hovering inches from her jaw, trembling with a restraint that seemed to cost him everything. "I am the man who allowed your world to burn," he admitted, his eyes dark with a raw, agonizing honesty. "And I am the man who will burn the rest of the world to keep you safe now." He didn't wait for her to answer, his lips hovering just a hair's breadth from hers, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was about to catch fire. The child on the bed let out a soft, sleepy whimper, breaking the spell and reminding them both that their sanctuary was built on shifting sand. Chapter 8. The Ghost of the Traitor. Morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a bruised purple dawn that bled through the holes in the roof. Kaia sat by the hearth, her eyes bleary from lack of sleep, watching Ronan tend to the boy with a tenderness that made her throat ache. Leo was awake now, his golden eyes wide and curious as he watched his father stitch a leather strap back together. The boy possessed a quiet dignity that was far beyond his years, a testament to the heavy burden of his bloodline. He looked so much like the man who had destroyed her life that it was hard to look at him, yet whenever he smiled at her, she felt a crack in the armor around her heart. Because she could no longer bear the weight of her own secrets, Kaia stood up and walked toward the small locked trunk she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She pulled out a tattered ledger, its pages yellowed by time and dampness, and dropped it on the table in front of Ronan. "My father wasn't a traitor," she said, her voice a flat, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet room. Ronan froze, his silver eyes narrowing as he looked at the book. He was the High Council's scapegoat. He discovered that they were the ones who orchestrated your father's assassination to put a puppet on the throne. Building on the shock that flickered across Ronan's face, Kaia began to pace the small room, her words spilling out like a confession. "He knew he couldn't survive the truth, so he hid the evidence and sent me away. He let the pack believe the lie because he knew they would kill me too if they thought I had the proof." She stopped in front of him, her chest heaving. "Your entire reign, Ronan, everything you built, it was all based on a foundation of blood and deception that the council handed you." The revelation was a physical blow, a truth that threatened to undo the very identity of the Alpha standing before her. Transitioning from shock to a cold, calculating fury, Ronan reached for the ledger, his fingers skimming over her father's frantic handwriting. He saw the dates, the names of the council members, and the records of payments made to the very assassins they had fought the night before. His jaw tightened until the bone looked ready to snap. "They used me," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "They turned me into a butcher to hide their own crimes." He looked up at Kaia, and for the first time, he saw her not as a victim of his past, but as the only person in the world who had the power to truly set him free. Following the weight of the discovery, a new kind of alliance began to form between them, one forged in the shared fire of vengeance. Ronan stood up, his height dwarfing the room once again, but this time his energy wasn't directed at her. "We cannot stay here," he stated, his voice regaining its kingly authority. "They know where we are, and they will send an army next time." He looked at Leo, then back at Kaia, his expression softening into something dangerously close to devotion. "Come with me, Kaia. Not as a mate, and not as a subject. Come with me to take back the pack that stole everything from us." The sound of distant hoofbeats began to vibrate through the earth, a rhythmic thumping that signaled the arrival of the council's heavy cavalry. Chapter 9. The Price of the Choice. The mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a trap, and the walls of the cabin were closing in on them like the jaws of a snare. Kaia looked around her home. The herbs she had dried, the cedar walls she had scrubbed, the peace she had fought so hard to find. To leave was to surrender the only safety she had ever known. To stay was to die. She looked at Leo, who was watching her with a silent, pleading hope, and then at Ronan, whose hand was outstretched toward her, palm up, waiting for her to choose a side in a war she had tried to ignore. Because she knew the cost of turning her back on fate, Kaia reached out and placed her hand in Ronan's, her skin sparking against his. The connection was instantaneous and overwhelming, a surge of power that made her wolf howl in triumph. "I'm not doing this for you, Ronan," she whispered, her voice fierce and unwavering. "I'm doing this for my father's name, and for the boy." Ronan's grip tightened, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in a gesture that felt like a promise. "That is enough for now," he replied, his eyes burning with a silver fire that promised a scorched earth retribution. Drawing upon their shared strength, they began to move with a synchronized urgency, packing only the essentials as the sound of the cavalry grew louder. Ronan took the lead, his senses expanded to their limit, scouting the perimeter for any signs of the incoming force. Kaia gathered her medicines and her knife, her movements sharp and efficient. They worked together like two halves of a single soul, their earlier animosity replaced by a grim, focused partnership. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the coming rain, a storm that would hide their tracks as they descended into the Valley of the Wolves. Transitioning from the cabin to the forest, they slipped out through the back, disappearing into the dense undergrowth just as the first line of silver-armored horses rounded the bend. Kaia didn't look back as the sounds of her home being ransacked echoed through the trees. She focused on the rhythm of Ronan's stride and the weight of the secret she carried in her pack. They were fugitives now, hunted by the very people who were supposed to lead them, but for the first time in 7 years, Kaia didn't feel alone. She felt like a predator returning to the hunt. Following the winding path of the mountain trail, Ronan stopped suddenly, his hand going to his hilt as a figure emerged from the shadows of a great oak. It wasn't an assassin, but a scout wearing the colors of a rival pack, the very pack Kaia's father had supposedly betrayed the Blackwood to. The man dropped to one knee, not before Ronan, but before Kaia. "The elders have been waiting for the Beta's daughter to return," he said, his voice echoing with an ancient, terrifying loyalty. "The true army is ready, my lady." Ronan looked at Kaia, a dark, intrigued smile playing on his lips as he realized that the woman he had come to rescue might be the one who already held the keys to the kingdom. Chapter 10. The Shadow of the Traitor. The deep forest air clung to Kaia's skin like a damp shroud, thick with the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of ancient iron. She stared down at the scout, a man named Silas whom she remembered from her childhood as a shadow in her father's private study. He remained motionless on one knee, his head bowed in a gesture of absolute fealty that seemed to irritate the very air around Ronan. The high alpha stood like a pillar of storm clouds, his hand resting on the pommel of his blade, his silver eyes darting between the kneeling man and the woman who had suddenly become the center of a different kind of gravity. Because the revelation of a secret army shifted the power dynamic in an instant, the silence between them became a battlefield of its own. Kaia felt the weight of the ledger in her pack, the physical proof of a conspiracy that had turned her life into a ghost story. She looked at Silas, her voice cracking the stillness with a cold authority she hadn't used since she was a girl in silk ribbons. "My father is dead, Silas. Why does the resistance still breathe?" The scout looked up, his eyes reflecting the dappled light of the canopy. "He didn't just hide evidence, my lady. He hid an entire legion of those who refused to bow to a council of murderers." Transitioning from a fugitive to a figurehead, Kaia felt Ronan's presence loom behind her, a heat that was both a comfort and a warning. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, and now he was realizing the woman he'd rejected was the daughter of the man who had truly held it together. "If you have an army," Ronan growled, his voice a low vibration that made the leaves tremble, "why let the council hunt my son across the border like an animal?" Silas didn't flinch, his gaze moving to the high alpha with a look of tempered steel. "Because we were waiting for the blood that could unite the fractured packs. We were waiting for her." Following the trail deeper into the heart of the traitor's territory, the trio moved in a tense, rhythmic formation that kept the young heir, Leo, safely in the center. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a fern felt like a potential ambush, but the forest seemed to recognize Kaia, the branches parting for her with an eerie, sentient grace. They reached the mouth of a hidden cavern, a jagged tear in the mountain side that breathed out the scent of old wood smoke and sharpening stone. Inside, hundreds of amber eyes ignited in the darkness, a sea of wolves who had been living in the shadows, waiting for the return of the beta's daughter. Building on the rising tension of the hidden camp, Ronan's wolf paced behind his ribs, a restless, territorial beast that didn't like being surrounded by strangers. He stayed close to Kaia, his arm occasionally brushing against hers, a contact that sent a jagged spark of electricity through her entire system. He was territorial, protective, and increasingly obsessed with the woman he had once helped discard. "They look at you like you're a god," he whispered into her ear, his breath hot and smelling of mint and wild honey. Kaia didn't look back at him, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "They look at me like I'm a debt that needs to be paid," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. The cavern opened into a massive underground hall where a map of the Blackwood territories was carved directly into the stone floor, illuminated by a dozen flickering braziers.
Chapter 11. The Mirror of the Past. The flickering light of the braziers cast long, distorted shadows against the cavern walls, making the Council of Elders look like ancient gargoyles carved from the earth itself. Kaia stood before the stone map, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of the borders she had lived on for 7 lonely years. Ronan stood at her shoulder, a silent, brooding sentinel, whose very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He was a man of action, being forced into a world of politics and ghosts, and the strain was visible in the tight set of his jaw and the way his fingers twitched toward his weapon every time an elder spoke. Because the evidence in the ledger was so damning, the atmosphere in the hall was one of simmering, explosive rage. The elders pointed out the locations of the council's strongholds, places where Ronan's own soldiers were being replaced by mercenaries and silver-clad zealots. "They didn't just frame your father, Kaia," one elder rasped, his eyes milky with age but sharp with intelligence. "They used the chaos of his betrayal to pass the blood decrees. They made it legal to execute anyone who questioned the High Council's authority." Kaia felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest as she realized her father's disgrace was the foundation for a tyranny she had ignored while hiding in her cabin. Transitioning from the global conflict to a more intimate pain, Ronan suddenly spoke, his voice cutting through the elders' murmurs like a thunderclap. "I signed those decrees." The room went dead silent, the air thickening with a sudden, lethal hostility. He didn't look at the elders. He looked directly at Kaia, his silver eyes raw with a confession that felt like an execution. "I thought I was securing peace. I thought the traitors were real, and that by being harsh I was protecting the pack from another civil war." The honesty in his voice was a physical weight, a jagged piece of glass that he was handing her, knowing it would cut them both. Following the admission, Kaia felt the mate bond twist in her gut, a painful, agonizing pull that forced her to feel his genuine remorse. She wanted to hate him for it, wanted to scream that his peace had cost her everything, but she saw the man he was now, a father who had nearly lost his son to the very laws he had written. She saw the scar on his forehead, a mark from a battle he had fought for a lie. "You weren't a king, Ronan," she said, her voice sounding far away. "You were their favorite weapon." The words hit him harder than a silver blade, and for a moment the High Alpha looked completely shattered. Building on the emotional wreckage, a new voice broke the silence, a voice that made Kaia's blood turn to ice. "And he's still their weapon, isn't he?" From the shadows of the back tunnel, a man stepped into the light, his face a younger, more arrogant mirror of the one Kaia had seen in her nightmares. It was Julian, the man who had rejected her in the snow 7 years ago. He was dressed in the silver-trimmed leather of the council's elite, his eyes fixed on Kaia with a look of possessive hunger that made her skin crawl. He wasn't there as a friend. He was there as an envoy of the very people they were planning to destroy. Julian smiled, a slow, oily expression that didn't reach his cold eyes as he looked at the woman he had once discarded like trash.
Chapter 12. The Serpent in the Den. The presence of Julian in the cavern was like a drop of poison in a clear well, instantly turning the loyalty of the Underground Legion into a chaotic mess of whispers and unsheathed claws. Ronan's transition was nearly instantaneous. His growl a low-frequency vibration that made the dust shake from the ceiling as he moved to stand in front of Kaia. The height difference between the two men was minimal, but the aura of power was vastly different. Ronan was a thunderstorm while Julian was a cold, calculating frost. The air between them crackled with the kind of animosity that usually ended in a pile of corpses and a burnt-down forest. Because he had spent years climbing the council's ranks, Julian didn't seem intimidated by the High Alpha's display of dominance. He held up a scroll sealed with the High Council's black wax, his gaze sliding past Ronan to lock onto Kaia. "I'm not here for a fight, Alpha," Julian said, his voice dripping with a false, practiced sincerity. "I'm here to offer the traitor's daughter a deal. The council knows about the ledger, they know about the army, and they are willing to restore your family name, Kaia, if you hand over the Alpha and his heir." Transitioning from a threat to a calculated gamble, Julian took a step closer, his eyes raking over Kaia as if he were memorizing the curves of the woman he had once thrown away. "Think about it, Kaia. Everything you lost, your status, your home, the respect of the pack, it can all be yours again. You just have to give up the man who oversaw your humiliation and the brat who will only bring more war to our borders." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every wolf in the room holding their breath to see if the woman who had been broken by the pack would now break the man who claimed to be her mate. Following the pulse of the bond, Kaia felt Ronan's heart rate spike, a frantic, desperate rhythm that told her he expected her to take the deal. He didn't move to stop her. He simply stood there, his back to her, waiting for the inevitable betrayal. He believed he deserved it. He believed that after everything he had done, her revenge was the only thing left to him. The weight of his resignation was almost more than she could bear, a crushing sorrow that made her want to reach out and pull him back from the edge of the abyss. Building on her internal conflict, Kaia walked around Ronan until she was standing face-to-face with Julian, her expression a mask of unreadable glass. She looked at the man who had broken her heart, and then she looked at the man who had accidentally claimed her soul. She saw the greed in Julian's eyes and the honest, agonizing love in Ronan's. "You want to give me back my name?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. She reached out, her fingers brushing the scroll in Julian's hand, before she suddenly grabbed his wrist and twisted it with a strength that made his bones pop. "I don't need you to give me my name, Julian," she hissed, her face inches from his as she pulled her silver knife and pressed it against his throat. "I'm going to take it back myself, over the bodies of the council you serve." The cavern erupted in a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the mountain, but as Julian laughed, a blood-choked, terrifying sound, Kaia realized that his presence here was merely a distraction for the betrayal already happening within their own ranks. Chapter 13. The Anatomy of Betrayal. The roaring approval of the Underground Legion still vibrated against the stone walls, but the sound felt hollow to Kaia as she watched the wicked glint in Julian's eyes. She kept her silver blade pressed against the pulse point of his neck, feeling the rhythmic thrum of his life beneath the steel. Julian didn't flinch. Instead, his smile widened, a jagged expression that promised a nightmare she hadn't yet imagined. Behind her, Ronan was a coiled spring of obsidian muscle, his presence radiating a heat that was almost blistering, yet he remained silent, allowing Kaia to hold the front. He was letting her lead, a surrender of his alpha pride that felt more intimate than any touch. Because Julian's laughter was so discordant with his position of vulnerability, Kaia's intuition began to scream. She looked past his shoulder, scanning the sea of amber eyes in the cavern, and noticed a subtle shift in the formation of the elders. They weren't cheering anymore. They were receding into the shadows of the tunnels, their expressions turning from righteous fury to cold, calculated indifference. The realization hit her like a plunge into a frozen lake. The council hadn't just sent an envoy. They had already bought the architecture of the resistance. Julian wasn't a messenger. He was the trigger for a trap that had been set long before she arrived. Transitioning from a moment of triumph to one of immediate peril, Kaia felt the air in the cavern grow heavy with the scent of burning sage and damp fur. "You really thought a few old men in a cave could stand against the wealth of the High Council?" Julian whispered, his voice a silk thread of malice. Before Kaia could pull the trigger of her resolve, a sharp, stinging sensation bloomed in her shoulder. She gasped, her grip on the knife faltering as she looked down to see a small feathered dart protruding from her skin. The world began to tilt, the flickering braziers stretching into long, golden ribbons of light that danced before her eyes. Following her collapse, the cavern exploded into a different kind of chaos. Ronan let out a roar that sounded like the earth splitting open, his hand reaching for her just as she hit the cold stone floor. He caught her, his massive arms a fortress around her failing body, but the Legion was no longer standing still. Half of the wolves turned on their brothers, silver-tipped spears emerging from the darkness. The Civil War hadn't waited for the battlefield. It had started in the heart of the sanctuary. Kaia tried to speak, to warn him about the elders, but her tongue felt like a lead weight, and the darkness began to swallow the edges of her vision. Building on the sudden fragmentation of their alliance, Ronan was forced to defend her while fending off 3 attackers at once. He didn't shift. He fought as a man, his movements a brutal, efficient dance of survival as he kicked a spear away and broke a hunter's neck with his bare hands. He was a god of war protecting a fallen star, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. Through the haze of the poison, Kaia saw Julian step forward, his boot heavy on her father's ledger, which had fallen in the scuffle. He looked down at her with a pity that was more insulting than his hatred. "I told you, Kaia," Julian sneered, his voice fading into a dull hum. "Fate is a trap, and you just walked right into the middle of it." Chapter 14. The Heat of the Hearth. The world returned to Kaia in fragments of heat and the sharp, acrid smell of burning wolfsbane. She was no longer in the cavern. The floor beneath her was wood, not stone, and the air lacked the damp chill of the mountain's belly. She tried to move her wrists, but they were bound by heavy silver-threaded silk, a material designed to suppress a shifter's strength without scarring the skin. She was in a room she recognized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. It was her old bedroom in the Blackwood pack house, the very place she had been dragged from 7 years ago. The council hadn't just captured her. They had brought her home to play out the final act of her humiliation. Because the poison was still sluggish in her veins, her wolf felt like it was trapped behind a wall of thick glass, scratching feebly to get out. She looked toward the door and saw Ronan. He wasn't bound, but he sat in a chair by the window, his head in his hands, his spirit looking more broken than she had ever seen it. He was covered in dried blood, none of it his own, and the raw power he usually carried seemed to have collapsed inward. They were in the heart of the enemy's territory, surrounded by the very people who had spent a decade engineering their ruin. "Leo?" Kaia rasped, her voice a dry crackle in the quiet room. Ronan's head snapped up, his silver eyes bloodshot and haunted. He was across the room in a second, kneeling by her bed, his hand hovering over her face but afraid to touch her. "The council has him," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They're using him as leverage for a public trial. They want us both to confess to the murder of my father and the betrayal of the pack." He looked at her silk bindings, his jaw clenching so hard she thought his teeth might shatter. "I should have left you in that cabin, Kaia. I brought my rot into your world." Transitioning from despair to a sudden, white-hot spark of defiance, Kaia leaned forward, the silver silk biting into her skin. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her eyes locking onto his. "You didn't bring this on me, Ronan. They did. They've been writing this story since before we were born, and if you give up now, you're letting them win the ending." The mate bond flared between them, a desperate, pulsing heat that seemed to bridge the gap of their shared agony. She saw the flicker of life return to his eyes, a tiny ember of the High Alpha's fire catching on the fuel of her rage. Following the emotional surge, the door swung open, and the High Council's head orator stepped in. a man named Valerius, whose face was as smooth and cold as a funeral urn. He looked at the pair with a clinical detachment, as if they were specimens in a jar rather than living, breathing souls. "The trial begins at sundown," Valerius announced, his voice a monotone drone. "You will have one chance to save the boy's life. You will stand before the pack, confess to your father's crimes, Kaia, and you, Ronan, will sign over the regency to the council. Do this, and the child lives in exile. Refuse, and he dies as a traitor's whelp." Valerius left as quickly as he had appeared, the heavy iron bolt sliding home with a sound that felt like a coffin lid closing. Chapter 15. The Claiming of the Soul. The room grew dark as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Mountains, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the floorboards. Ronan stood up, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the window. He looked at Kaia, his expression unreadable, before he walked over and began to untie her silk bindings with hands that were surprisingly gentle. The silver in the thread burned him, the skin of his palms sizzling and turning red, but he didn't even flinch. He was focused entirely on her, his movements methodical and purposeful as if he were performing a sacred ritual. Because the proximity of death had stripped away every layer of pretense, the air between them became thick with a heavy physical desire. When the last binding fell away, Kaia didn't move. She stayed on the bed, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the blood rushed back into her hands. Ronan didn't pull away this time. He leaned in, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing the high curve of her cheekbones. "If this is the last night we have," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous purr, "I want you to know that I didn't choose you because of a bond. I chose you because you were the only person who looked at the Butcher King and saw a man." Transitioning from a vow to a desperate, explosive physical connection, Ronan leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of salt, iron, and a decade of suppressed longing. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision of two stars, a frantic, hungry claiming that made Kaia's entire world dissolve into the scent of sandalwood and rain. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair as she met his intensity with her own. The mate bond roared to life, no longer a tether, but a bonfire that consumed her fear and her shame, leaving only the raw, primal truth of their connection. Following the fire of the kiss, Ronan pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his forehead pressed against hers. "I will not let them take you again," he vowed, his silver eyes glowing with a feral light. "We are going to that trial, and we are going to burn their lies to the ground." Kaia felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with her wolf and everything to do with the man standing before her. She was no longer the traitor's daughter hiding in a cabin. She was a woman who had been chosen by a king, not by fate, but by the jagged, beautiful reality of love. Building on the shared resolve, they began to prepare for the theater of the council's justice. They knew they were walking into a lion's den, but for the first time in her life, Kaia wasn't afraid of the pack's judgment. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing the girl who had been shamed in the snow, and then she looked at Ronan. She saw a man who would kneel for her, and she knew that no matter what happened in that great circle, the council had already lost. They could take her life, but they could never again take her worth. The heavy footsteps of the guards echoed in the hallway, signaling that the time for secrets was over, and the time for the truth had finally arrived. Chapter 16. The Theater of Thorns. The great circle of the Blackwood Pack was an amphitheater of jagged stone and ancient judgment, lit by towering pyres that sent thick black smoke spiraling into the midnight sky. Kaia walked beside Ronan, her chin held high even as the heavy iron shackles rattled against her wrists with every step. Thousands of eyes tracked their movement, some filled with the familiar, icy contempt she had lived with for years, others clouded with a new, flickering uncertainty. The air was a suffocating soup of scents, the acrid bite of burning pine, the sweat of a nervous crowd, and the underlying metallic tang of the silver-tipped spears held by the council's elite. Because the council had designed this moment to be a final execution of her dignity, they had placed her father's old beta crest on a pike in the center of the ring. It was tarnished, its gold leaf peeling like dead skin, a visual metaphor for the legacy she was supposed to carry. Ronan's presence beside her was a mountain of silent fury, his shadow stretching across the stone floor like a dark omen. He didn't look at the crowd. His silver eyes were locked on the high dais where the 5 elders of the council sat, looking down like vultures waiting for the first sign of weakness. Transitioning from the walk of shame to the center of the pit, Kaia felt the familiar chill of the great circle snow beginning to seep through her thin boots. This was the exact spot where Julian had rejected her 7 years ago, the stone still holding the phantom heat of her tears. Valerius stood at the front of the dais, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone bowl. Kaia Vale, daughter of the traitor Silas, and Ronan, the butcher king who abandoned his people, he proclaimed, his words dripping with a rehearsed, oily venom. You stand accused of the highest treason, the murder of the previous High Alpha and the conspiracy to sell our secrets to the rivals. Following the accusation, a low, ominous rumble of growls rose from the pack members, a sound like a coming landslide. Ronan stepped forward, his chains clinking with a rhythmic finality that silenced the crowd. The only traitors in this circle are the men sitting on those high chairs, he stated, his voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the dais. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The authority of a High Alpha, even one in chains, was a physical weight that pressed down on the chests of everyone present. He looked at the elders, his lip curling in a snarl that revealed the predator lurking just beneath the surface. Building on the tension of the standoff, Valerius signaled to the guards, who brought forward a small, trembling figure. It was Leo. The boy was pale, his silk shirt stained with the dust of a dungeon, but his golden eyes were fixed on Kaia with a heartbreaking trust. Confess, Kaia Vale. Valerius sneered, his hand hovering near the boy's throat. Confess that your father killed the king and admit that Ronan was his accomplice. Do it now, or the boy's blood will be the last thing you see before your own execution. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as if the world had stopped breathing, waiting for the traitor's daughter to break. Chapter 17. The Weight of the Lie. Kaia looked at the child, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed down to the pulse jumping in Leo's neck. She felt the heavy weight of the ledger tucked inside her tunic, the secret she had carried through the woods, but she knew that logic meant nothing in the face of a mob. The council had already won the narrative. They had spent 7 years painting her father as a monster and Ronan as his puppet. If she spoke the truth now, the crowd would hear it as the desperate lies of a condemned woman. She looked at Ronan, searching for a sign, but he had closed his eyes, his head bowed in a posture of absolute, soul-crushing defeat. Because he believed the only way to save his son was to surrender, Ronan's spirit seemed to physically shrink within the circle of the pyres. He was ready to sign the lie. He was ready to let the world believe he was a murderer if it meant Leo could walk out of those stone gates alive. The mate bond between them was a frayed, agonizing thing, pulsing with his resignation and his grief. It made Kaia's skin crawl with a sudden, violent rejection of the ending they were being offered. She wasn't just the girl in the snow anymore. She was the woman who had survived the mountain, and she refused to let her father's memory be buried under a coward's confession. Transitioning from silent despair to a sudden, explosive defiance, Kaia stepped in front of Ronan, her chains snapping taut. "I have no confession for you, Valerius," she shouted, her voice ringing out like a silver bell over the crackling of the flames. The pack gasped, a wave of shock rippling through the thousands of onlookers. Even Julian, standing in the shadows of the dais, looked startled by the raw power in her tone. "My father didn't kill the king. He died protecting the truth that you, the council, are the ones who turned our pack into a graveyard for your own profit." Following her outburst, the council elders began to shout for order, their faces turning a frantic, blotchy red. "Silence her!" Valerius screamed, his clinical mask finally slipping to reveal the panicked tyrant beneath. "She is contaminated by her father's madness!" Two guards lunged forward, their silver spears aimed at her chest, but they never reached her. Ronan's eyes snapped open, glowing with a silver light so bright it looked like liquid moonbeams. He didn't shift, but the sheer force of his alpha command hit the guards like a physical wall, sending them sprawling backward into the dirt. Building on the chaos, Kaia reached into her tunic and pulled out the tattered ledger, holding it high for the pack to see. "This is my father's lifeblood," she cried, her eyes scanning the faces of the wolves she had once called family. "It contains the records of every bribe, every assassination, and every lie the council told to put Ronan on a throne they intended to control. They didn't want a king. They wanted a butcher who would take the blame when the world finally realized what they had done." She saw the doubt beginning to bloom in the eyes of the younger pack members, a flicker of light in the darkness of the council's reign. Valerius grabbed Leo by the shoulder, pulling a thin silver dagger from his belt and pressing it against the boy's skin. "One more word, and the brat dies." Chapter 18. The Shattering of the Silence. The sight of the blade against the boy's throat felt like a cold hand wrapping around Kaia's heart, squeezing until she couldn't breathe. She looked at Leo, whose eyes were wide with a terror that no child should ever know, and then at the thousands of wolves who were watching their future be threatened by their own leaders. The silence in the great circle was no longer respectful. It was a pressurized chamber, seconds away from an explosion that would level the entire mountain. She saw the elders looking around, realizing for the first time that they had lost the crowd, that the fear they had used to rule was being replaced by a much more dangerous emotion, righteous rage. Because the council was cornered, they did the only thing they had left. They called for the total rejection. "Ronan!" Valerius shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Reject her! Reject the traitor's daughter publicly, and we will spare the boy. Give up the bond, and we will let the heir live in exile. If you do not, we will execute you all as a pack of rabid animals." The demand was the ultimate cruelty, a repeat of the trauma that had defined Kaia's life. She looked at Ronan, her heart breaking for the man who was being asked to destroy his soul to save his blood. Transitioning from a witness to a victim once again, Kaia prepared herself for the words. She braced her spirit for the cold snap of the bond breaking, for the public humiliation that had become her constant companion. She saw Ronan look at her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it was almost unbearable. He moved toward her, his heavy chains dragging in the snow, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. He didn't look at the council. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at the woman who had taught him that a throne was nothing compared to the truth. Following the movement, Ronan did something that no high alpha had done in the history of the Blackwood Pack. He didn't stand tall to reject her. He dropped to his knees. The sound of his armor hitting the stone was a thunderclap that echoed through the valley. He knelt in the dirt, his head bowed, his hands open in a gesture of absolute surrender. Not to the council, but to her. "I will not reject her," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater, steady and unbreakable. "I will not reject the woman who is the heart of this pack. If you want a traitor to execute, take me. But Kaia Vale is your true queen." Building on the shock of the alpha's submission, the pack members began to stand one by one, their growls turning into a rhythmic, deafening roar of defiance. The silver-clad guards hesitated, their loyalty wavering as they saw their king kneeling before a woman they had been told to hate. Valerius raised the dagger, his face a mask of insane fury, but before the blade could touch the boy's skin, a white blur erupted from the crowd. Silas's hidden legion, the wolves from the cavern, had infiltrated the circle. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of shifting bone and the scream of 1,000 wolves reclaiming their home. The great circle descended into a beautiful, violent chaos as the walls of the council's lies finally crumbled, leaving Kaia and Ronan standing in the center of a storm they had started together. Chapter 19. The King's Penance. The thunder of the kneeling Alpha was a sound that shattered the very foundation of the High Council's authority. Ronan stayed on his knees in the filth and the frost, his massive head bowed before Kaia as if she were the only deity left in a world of crumbling idols. The pack members stood frozen, their breath hitching in a collective gasp that sucked the heat from the pyres. No one had ever seen a Blackwood Alpha lower himself. Certainly not the Butcher King, a man whose name was synonymous with uncompromising dominance. By kneeling, he wasn't just claiming her. He was publicly admitting that the power he had wielded for a decade was a hollow crown compared to her worth. Because the weight of his submission was so absolute, the council's control disintegrated in the span of a single heartbeat. Valerius stood on the dais, his hand trembling as he pressed the silver dagger against Leo's throat, but his eyes were wide with a sudden, paralyzing realization. He wasn't looking at a condemned prisoner anymore. He was looking at the beginning of a revolution. The shimmering gold of the mate bond between Kaia and Ronan pulsed with a violent, blinding light, a spiritual frequency that began to trigger the shifts of every wolf in the circle. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and the rhythmic clicking of bones being rewritten by the primal call of a true pair. Transitioning from the shock of the kneeling to the eruption of the war, the hidden legion of Silas's wolves threw off their dark cloaks, revealing the battle scars of a resistance that had survived in the shadows for 7 years. "For the Beta's daughter!" a voice cried out from the eastern ridge, Silas's old commander, his eyes glowing with a vengeful fire. The great circle transformed into a slaughterhouse of silver and fur as the resistance wolves collided with the council's elite. The sound was a symphony of carnage, the whistle of arrows, the wet thud of spears meeting flesh, and the terrifying melodic howling of wolves who were finally allowed to hunt their oppressors. Following the surge of the attack, Kaia didn't wait for her chains to be broken by others. She grabbed the heavy iron link connecting her wrists and slammed it against the sharp edge of a stone altar with a strength fueled by 7 years of suppressed rage. The metal snapped with a shower of sparks, the silver-threaded silk biting into her skin one last time before she was free. She didn't look for safety, she looked for the child. She saw Valerius trying to drag Leo toward the back tunnels, his face a mask of panicked greed. She began to run, her feet barely touching the blood-slicked stone, her wolf finally bursting through the internal barriers of her mind. Building on the momentum of her freedom, Kaia felt the familiar, agonizing heat of the shift. It wasn't the sluggish, painful transition of her youth, it was an explosive rebirth. Her skin tore away to reveal fur the color of winter moonlight, and her bones elongated with a grace that was purely predatory. She didn't just shift, she ascended. For the first time since her rejection, her wolf was whole, larger and more formidable than any beta-born female in history. She let out a howl that silenced the battle for a split second, a sound of pure, unadulterated sovereignty that announced to the mountain that the queen had returned to claim her throne. Ronan rose from his knees, his own shift occurring in midair as he lunged toward the dais, a midnight black shadow of death intended for the men who had dared to threaten his son.
Chapter 20. The Breach of the Dais. The black wolf that was Ronan hit the stone dais with the force of a falling star, his claws shredding the silk banners of the High Council as he tore through the first line of guards. He wasn't fighting like a king. He was fighting like a father, a primal force of nature that cared nothing for strategy or survival, only for the blood of those who had touched his heir. Behind him, the moonlight-white wolf that was Kaia cleared the steps in a single fluid leap, her teeth bared in a snarl that promised 1,000 years of retribution. They fought as a dual-edged blade, their movements perfectly synchronized by the pulse of the mate bond, a dance of death that left a trail of silver-armored corpses in its wake. Because the council had grown soft on bribes and backroom deals, they were utterly unprepared for the raw, visceral violence of a pair of fated mates fighting for their family. Valerius backed away toward the edge of the stone precipice, still clutching Leo, but his footing was treacherous on the blood-slicked marble. "Stay back!" he shrieked, the dagger nicking the boy's skin. Leo didn't cry out. He looked at the white wolf with an expression of such intense recognition that it seemed to give Kaia a second wind. She didn't lunge. She waited, her amber eyes locking onto Valerius's with a cold, calculating intelligence that terrified the orator more than any growl. Transitioning from the chaos of the melee to a moment of sharp, lethal focus, Ronan circled the dais, cutting off the escape routes. He was a wall of black fur and muscle, his growl a low, subsonic vibration that seemed to loosen the very stones of the amphitheater. Julian, who had been watching from the shadows, finally stepped forward, his own silver blade drawn. He looked at the white wolf, a flicker of his old possessive arrogance crossing his face. "She was mine first, Alpha," Julian sneered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the battle. "I should have killed her in the snow when I had the chance." Following the insult, Ronan didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Julian, the two of them becoming a blur of black fur and gleaming steel. It was the battle the pack had been waiting for, the old world of titles and rejection versus the new world of choice and blood. Julian was fast, his movements honed by the Council's elite training, but Ronan was driven by a soul-deep desperation that made him unstoppable. He took a shallow cut to his shoulder, just to get close enough to bury his fangs in Julian's arm, the sound of bone snapping echoing across the dais like a dry branch in winter. Building on the distraction of the Alpha's duel, Kaia saw her opening. She didn't shift back. She used the agility of her wolf form to feint a lunge at Valerius's legs, forcing him to shift his weight. As he stumbled, she used her massive head to ram into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending the dagger skittering across the stone. Leo fell from his grasp and Kaia was there in an instant, her large body shielding the child from the fallout of the fight. She stood over him, a lunar guardian, as the resistance wolves finally swarmed the dais, pinning the remaining elders to the ground. Valerius looked up into the muzzles of a dozen vengeful wolves, his face finally reflecting the absolute terror he had inflicted on others for a generation.
Chapter 21. The Choice of the Pack. The high-velocity violence of the coup slowed into a heavy, expectant silence as the last of the Council's guards dropped their weapons. The Great Circle was a graveyard of broken lies. The snow turned to a muddy crimson under the light of the waning moon. Ronan shifted back into his human form, his skin covered in a map of scratches and Julian's blood, his chest heaving as he stood over the broken remains of his former rival. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had finally finished a marathon through hell. He turned his gaze toward the center of the dais, where the white wolf was slowly shifting back into the woman he loved. Because the pack was now leaderless and the old laws were in ashes, every eye turned to Kaia as she stood up, wrapping a discarded council banner around her naked shoulders. She held Leo in her arms, the boy clinging to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of ghosts. The silence was absolute, a void that demanded a new word, a new law. She looked at the thousands of wolves waiting for her judgment, the people who had shamed her, the people who had followed her, and the people who were now realizing that their entire history was a fabrication. Transitioning from the heat of the battle to the cold reality of the aftermath, Kaia walked to the edge of the dais, her father's ledger still clutched in her hand. She didn't look at Ronan yet. She looked at the pack. "The council is dead," she said, her voice carrying through the cold air with a clarity that felt like a new dawn. "But the lies they told are still living in your hearts. You followed them because it was easy to hate a traitor's daughter. You followed them because you were afraid of the truth." She threw the ledger onto the ground below, the pages fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. Following her words, a low murmur of shame rippled through the crowd, a collective realization that made many of the older wolves bow their heads. Ronan walked up behind her, his hand settling on her shoulder, not in a gesture of dominance, but in one of support. He looked at the pack, then back at her, his silver eyes shining with a pride that was almost blinding. "I will not lead you any more," Ronan announced, his voice booming. "I was a king made of shadows. If you want a future, you will have to choose it. You will have to choose her." Building on the finality of his abdication, the mate bond between them flared one last time, a golden light that seemed to encompass the entire Great Circle. It wasn't a supernatural command. It was a testament to a choice made in the face of destruction. The pack began to howl. Not a howl of war, but one of mourning for the past and hope for the future. They weren't just howling for a new alpha, they were howling for the woman who had survived the bed of thorns to lead them back to the light. As the first rays of a true sun began to peek over the Blackwood peaks, Kaia looked at Ronan and finally let out the breath she had been holding for 7 years. Chapter 22. The Ash and the Altar. The morning sun did not rise with a golden glow. It struggled through a heavy, charcoal-colored haze, as if the sky itself were ashamed to look upon the carnage of the Great Circle. Smoke from the dying pyres curled around the stone pillars like ghostly snakes, whispering of the empires that had crumbled in a single night of blood and truth. Kaia stood at the center of the dais, the silk banner of the High Council draped over her shoulders like a shroud she had turned into a robe of state. Her bare feet were stained with the crimson history of her pack, yet she felt a strange, light buoyancy in her chest. The weight of 7 years of shame had finally been vaporized by the heat of the uprising. Because the transition of power is never a silent affair, the air was filled with the low, rhythmic chanting of the resistance wolves and the sharp, staccato orders of those tending to the wounded. Ronan was a constant grounding heat at her back, his presence a silent shield against the lingering stares of the pack members who still hadn't processed the fall of their idols. He looked at the mountain of discarded silver spears, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He had spent a decade being the hammer of the council, and now, for the first time, he was the architect of something built on a foundation of honesty rather than fear. Transitioning from the violence of the coup to the administrative reality of a new era, Kaia watched as Silas's men dragged the surviving elders into the very dungeons they had once used to disappear their enemies. There was no joy in the sight, only a profound sense of closure that tasted like salt and iron. She looked down at Leo, who had fallen asleep against her leg, his small chest rising and falling in the first peaceful slumber he had known since the hunt began. He was the bridge between the old blood and the new world, a living testament to the fact that fate could be redirected by a single act of defiance. Following the movement of the crowd, a group of the Blackwood's eldest women approached the dais, their faces etched with the deep lines of 1,000 winters. They didn't carry weapons. They carried a basin of mountain water and a crown of woven pine and ironwood, the traditional regalia of the Beta's line, hidden away since the day her father was branded a traitor. They knelt before Kaia, not in the forced submission they had shown the council, but with a slow, reverent grace that brought tears to her eyes. "We knew the moon would bring you back to us," the eldest whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The mountain never forgot your name, even when we were too afraid to speak it." Building on the emotional gravity of the restoration, Ronan stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his broken blade. He didn't look at the crown. He looked at Kaia, his silver eyes searching hers for the final confirmation of the choice they had made in the dark of the prison cell. The mate bond was no longer a frantic, screaming thing. It had settled into a deep, resonant hum that synchronized their heartbeats. It was a partnership of equals, a covenant of blood and choice that transcended the ancient laws of the moon. The wind picked up, scattering the ashes of the council's decrees into the valley below, clearing the air for the words that would define their future.
Chapter 23. The Sovereign's Choice. The ceremony of the new moon was a quiet, solemn affair, held not in the jagged amphitheater of judgment, but in the lush, green heart of the ancestral groves where the first wolves had made their pact with the earth. Kaia stood beneath the great oak, the pine and ironwood crown resting lightly on her brow, her white wolf-skin cloak flowing behind her like a river of moonlight. The pack was gathered in a wide circle, their amber eyes glowing with a newfound clarity as they watched the woman they had once rejected take her place as the sovereign of the Blackwood. There were no chains, no silver spears, and no lies, only the scent of damp earth and the promise of a long-delayed spring. Because she refused to rule through the same dominance that had nearly destroyed them, Kaia did not stand on a pedestal. She stood on the same mossy ground as her people, her gaze meeting theirs with an honesty that demanded respect rather than fear. She spoke of her father's sacrifice, of the long years in the cabin, and of the realization that a pack's strength was not measured by its alpha's cruelty, but by its capacity to protect the vulnerable. Her voice was steady, a low melody that seemed to resonate with the very roots of the trees, weaving a new story into the fabric of their shared history. Transitioning from her declaration to the final act of her transformation, Kaia turned to Ronan, who stood a few paces away, dressed in the simple leather of a warrior rather than the gold-trimmed armor of a high alpha. He had spent the morning formally abdicating his titles, handing over the administrative keys of the territory to a council of elders chosen by the people. He was a man without a kingdom, a wolf without a pack, yet he had never looked more powerful. The Butcher King was dead, and in his place stood a man who was ready to be a partner, a father, and a protector. Following the pulse of the bond, Ronan walked toward her, his movements fluid and humble. He didn't ask for a place at her side. He waited for her to grant it. The silence of the grove was heavy with the expectation of the pack. They waited for the claiming, for the moment the alpha would assert his right over his mate. But Kaia simply reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his in a gesture of simple human affection. "I do not claim you because fate demanded it," she said, her voice carrying through the trees like a soft breeze. "I choose you because you are the man who knelt when the world told you to stand." Building on the power of her choice, Ronan leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of absolute intimacy that made the pack let out a collective, soft howl of approval. The mate bond sealed not with a display of dominance but with a quiet, shimmering glow that seemed to emanate from their joined hands. It was the final healing of the wound that had started in the snow 7 years ago. They were no longer the traitor's daughter and the Butcher King. They were simply Kaia and Ronan, two broken souls who had found a way to be whole together. Leo ran out from the crowd, throwing his arms around their legs and laughing as the first true rain of spring began to fall, washing away the last of the blood from the stone. Chapter 24. The Legacy of the Mountain. The rain fell in gentle rhythmic sheets, turning the scorched earth of the great circle into a field of rich, dark mud from which the first green shoots of the season would soon emerge. Kaia sat on the porch of a new cabin, built not on the border of a rival territory but in the heart of the Blackwood village, its doors open to anyone who sought counsel or healing. She watched the pack members working together to rebuild the storehouses. Their movements lacked the frantic, fearful energy of the council's reign. The mountain felt different now. The air was lighter, the shadows less predatory, and the silence was no longer a place for hiding, but a place for peace. Because the path to healing is a long one, Kaia knew that the scars of the past would never fully disappear, nor did she want them to. They were reminders of the strength it took to survive the thorns. She looked at her father's beta crest, now polished and hanging above her hearth, a symbol of a name restored and a debt paid in full. She was no longer running from the ghost of Silas Vale. She was carrying his legacy forward into a world that finally knew the truth. The humiliation of the snow had been replaced by the warmth of the hearth, and the fear of needing love had been replaced by the joy of having it. Transitioning from the porch to the warmth of the interior, she felt Ronan's arms wrap around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the rain. He smelled of cedar and home, a scent that had become her favorite anchor in a world that was still finding its footing. "The scouts report that the southern packs are asking for a treaty," he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "They've heard about the woman who broke the High Council with a silver knife and a ledger." Kaia smiled, leaning back into his strength. "Let them wait," she replied. "Today, I'm just a mother and a mate." Following the peaceful quiet of the moment, Leo tumbled across the floor with a young pup from the neighborhood, their playful growls a sharp, beautiful contrast to the violent sounds of the coup. The boy was thriving, his golden eyes bright with a mischief that had been absent during their flight through the woods. He would grow up in a pack where power was a responsibility, not a right, and where the Alpha's heir was a title earned through service rather than blood. He was the future they had fought for, a future that was no longer a trap, but a horizon. Building on the finality of their journey, the moon began to rise through the clearing clouds, a silver sliver that watched over the mountain like a silent guardian. Kaia looked up at the light, her wolf purring deep in her chest, a sound of absolute unshakable worth. She had moved from isolation to partnership, from shame to value, and from survival to a life that was finally, truly her own. She wasn't just the woman he swore to destroy, she was the woman who had saved him, and together, they had rewritten the fate of the wolves. As the last light of the day faded into a soft velvet blue, Ronan turned her in his arms, his eyes reflecting the silver of the moon and the heat of the fire, and for the first time in her life, Kaia Vale wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring.